Hey, everybody, welcome to Locker Room. This is Southland's podcast for men, where we demons conversations talk about the right things in the right ways. My name is Scott Hatfield. Thanks for checking out the podcast. This podcast is all about creating a culture of strong, godly men that fight for the most important things. And we are in the middle of this last series of season 14 called Southland Men, and we're just highlighting great stories of what God's doing in and through some men in our church that have taken ground, are fighting in battles, that are standing where they need to, resisting the enemy and taking just good kingdom ground. And so I love this. And the fact is that these are great stories of our men, but they all shine a light toward the hero in our story, which is Jesus. And today my guest is Bryan Taylor, man. How are you?
I'm doing great, brother. Thank you so much for having me.
Good to have you, man. Can you hear me okay? We good?
Hear you great,
okay, just want to make sure we're good. Hey, as we get in, it's a big church, 5 campuses. Tell us a little bit about your family. What's that look like for you? What has it look like? What does it look like now?
Yes, sir. Yeah. Yes, sir. So I live in Georgetown with my wife, Erin, and 3 kiddos, okay. Noah, Story, and John. And so we've got 3, 4 and under, 4 years old, 2.5, and 1.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's awesome, buddy.
It is. It's a true blessing. Drink a lot of coffee these days.
Yeah, that's right. I bet.
No doubt. So, but my wife, Erin, we've been married about 6 years. Okay. 6 years in May. Yeah. And of course, we're here today to talk about what led up to that and the years prior to our marriage and also the years since. But we live in Georgetown, go to the Georgetown campus.
Gotcha.
We've been there since 2019, about the time we got married. Before that, we were split time between the Nicholasville and Lexington campuses.
Gotcha. Very good. Vocationally, what do you do?
So I'm a pharmacist by training.
Okay. And drug dealer.
Yeah, that's right. Licensed drug dealer. That's a key distinction.
That's right.
But yeah, I own and operate a medical education company. So I do a lot of writing and speaking and
very cool
stuff like that. But I still do a little bit of patient care on the side. But yeah, pharmacist.
Okay. Gotcha. And tell me about how long you've been a part of Southland campus. You kind of mentioned a little bit what you're doing, because you said the Georgetown campus now, but you were at the Nicholasville campus originally.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yep.
And then just some different areas where you've been involved, or you're serving groups, that type of thing.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. So been going to Southland regularly since 2008, so 17 years. Started off here at 608 back in the days when I was at UK.
Yeah. And where are you from originally?
So I grew up in Western Kentucky.
That's right.
So near Owensboro, kind of out in the forest outside of Owensboro, essentially. Okay. But grew up on a farm in Ohio County area, a town called Matanzas, which nobody's heard of. So I always say near Owensboro. But, but yeah.
So you're UK and found Southland.
That's right. I've been in Lexington, Georgetown since 2007, 2008.
Okay.
And so 608 started 2008, and then we were at the Nicholasville campus all throughout college and pharmacy school. Yeah. And then when Lexington opened, we started going there. And then when Erin and I got married, moved to Georgetown, we started going to the Georgetown campus.
Yeah, gotcha. So we're talking about your current family, and where we're going to go today in your story is what happened several years before all of that. And you and I met a while back, and this is before I was hosting Locker Room. And I got to know a little bit more of your story, and just, man, as someone who's been married to a breast cancer survivor, I just really resonated with that. And you've shared some beautiful things and some really hard things just in the midst of us having that conversation as we got to know each other. But you're a young guy, 36?
36, right? You got it.
Been through a lot in a short spell. And so we're not going to hide the ball when it comes to where we're going. But what we're going to do is kind of 3 parts today, just so that way everybody knows where we're going. But we're going to talk about your relationship with your first wife, which is Kailen, and she ends up with a really bad diagnosis and passes away. And we're going to talk about the second part of that is really how you navigated that. And then the third part, God just done a remarkable work in you, and so I want to do a little bit more of a deep dive around some practical insight and application around loss and grief. And so, that cool? You
Absolutely.
With that?
Great plan.
Good. So if you're a regular Locker Room listener, you may go, well, wait, didn't we just do one on grief with Gary Black? And I'm going to say, yeah, sure did. This is on purpose. Grief's a universal monster that has an incredible impact on all of us, including men. And so these are going to be great resources that don't stack on top of each other. They're really more they're able to help. They really kind of complement each other. And so, and I'm even going to share another podcast that we did a long time ago, or not a long time, several years ago before this, that Scott Nickel walked through that I want to make sure that people are aware of as well. So we got a lot to cover. We'll get after it. Begin by just talking about how you met Kailen, dating, engagement, marriage stuff prior to her diagnosis. Kind of just walk me through that.
Sure. Yeah. So we met at 608 here in this building right about 16 years ago.
Where was she from?
She was from Oldham County, grew up in LaGrange, Crestwood area.
Okay.
and her family still lives there. So that's where she grew up, and then moved to Lexington for school, just like I did. So met at 608, November of 2009, and kind of when you know, I saw her walking up the steps in the old, before they did the renovation.
Yeah.
And I thought, man, I need to meet her in the atrium afterward. Church is a great place to meet somebody.
I'm telling you, man, it's the best place.
Yeah, 608 was an amazing place to meet your spouse. So we started dating the next month in December 2009.
Okay.
And then exactly to the day, 12 months later, we got married.
I love that, man.
Yep.
I love that.
My advice to young men is if you're getting engaged, make it a short engagement if you can. Because when you know, and there's no reason to delay.
Yeah.
And of course, in our story, we found out retrospectively that there really was no reason to delay. We didn't have nearly as much time as we thought, and I'm so grateful for the Lord's provision in that.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. And so as you all started dating, you learned that she already had some medical stuff that she was going through. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I knew a little bit about that when I first met her because, interestingly, we'll come back to this later, but Erin, my current wife, introduced me to Kailen that night in the atrium here at Southland.
That's cool.
And so I knew, Facebook was sort of a thing in 2009. It was becoming a bigger thing. And I knew from that she had been to Mayo Clinic a few times and had done some pretty serious health issues, one of which was a blood clot that was potentially fatal. And then the bigger thing, the more chronic thing, was Crohn's disease.
Okay.
And she'd had that.
Explain Crohn's a little bit, just because not everybody's going to just go, oh, Crohn's.
For sure. Yeah, inflammatory bowel disease is kind of the category, but Crohn's is essentially chronic inflammation in your intestines, essentially. And so it manifests as just extreme urgency, inability to eat most foods without causing pain or an urgent trip to the bathroom. No matter where we went, we had to be near a restroom. There was really no hiking at the gorge or going swimming. Stuff like that was hard. It was a very severe disease that she contended with, and it caused her to be anemic. She lost a lot of blood through her bowels. Yeah. And there were even times when her electrolytes would get so low, she was at risk of cardiac events and things like that. So it was a very serious thing.
She came here for college too, right?
She did. Yep. She was pre-pharmacy as well.
Gotcha.
Crohn's ended up kind of derailing those plans a little bit. She ended up going to Spencerian College and becoming a CNA phlebotomist.
Gotcha.
Kind of as a backup plan, sort of. But she just didn't have. Rarely did she have much energy because of all that blood loss. Yeah. So
you told me about a time when you were on a date and she'd gotten up a bunch to go to the bathroom, and she said something that was pretty prophetic. That I don't want to go any further until you share that story, but it's pretty powerful.
Yeah, it was an inflection point in my whole life, more so than I could have known at that time. We were at Firehouse Subs on campus, and I was just a kid. I wasn't probably overly observant, but during that time together, because I was just thinking, man, this is an amazing girl. Yeah, that's all I was focused on. And it never occurred to me that during the hour and a half we were sitting there, she'd gone to the bathroom probably 10 or 11 times, and eventually I kind of started to notice, man, I wonder if she's feeling okay. Yeah. Of course, I knew she had Crohn's. I knew she had battled it, but even though I was medical, I'd never experienced it firsthand. And so as we walked back to her car, which was over near Memorial Coliseum, we walked back down the sidewalk there. And I remember it like almost photographically, like it was just the other day. She looked at me and she said, I can tell that this is getting a little more serious and like that this relationship may go somewhere. And before we do that, I feel like it's only fair to you to know that when I was a little girl, God told me that he made me to do very hard things in this life. And she just said, I think you need to know that right now, before you step in any farther. And if you're not willing to do hard things, we probably need to go ahead and call this, And, of course, that struck me pretty firmly in the chest. And I could see in her eyes that it was sincere. Yeah. She believed the Lord had told her that. And I said, you know what, I'm willing to do hard things if I get to do them with you, was my response. And it was a somewhat of a romantic, almost cliched response, but that cliche got pulled back pretty quickly in the months and years that followed.
Yeah. Wow. So you guys met November, married December 2009, right? Is that right? 2010 or married 2010?
You got it.
Yeah, that's
married
right.
2010.
Married life, what was it like as a college student, both of you? And she's kind of now at Spencer, and you're at UK.
Yeah.
She's things are for the most part pretty good, but what's that like?
I mean, it was pretty idyllic. I mean, she had health issues. They were a common thing. We couldn't there were lots of things we weren't able to do like a normal, we were 21 and 2 when we got married.
Young.
Or 20 and 21 actually when we got married. But we just weren't able to do the normal young person stuff. But it was still, I've always called it was pretty Sparksian, like a Nicholas Sparks novel. Like we had this story that started off just in a way that you'd write it in a novel. Like it was just the way we met, the dating relationship, and we lived in a little bitty apartment in Hamburg, and we shared. So we had so many things in common. We loved to read. We got a dog. Took her for a walk in the park across the street.
Yeah.
And it was very much a fairy tale type relationship, and that's the tagline for some of my speaking and writing later on was life can be a fairy tale even when it's a tragedy.
Yeah.
And in fact, we know from the podcast with Gary and other ones that we've talked about that it has to be. Tragedy comes for all of us, and so it was, despite what we were going through, it was a very wonderful start to marriage.
So take me to the day, because life's pretty good. Again, battling some stuff, and all of a sudden she says, "Hey, I need you to come in here and check this, feel this. I think I've got a lump or a mass." Talk about that.
Yeah, and so at this point, this is September of 2012.
Okay.
So we've been married a year and 9 months approximately. And I started pharmacy school in September of 2011. So I'm starting my second year of pharmacy school. So I'm, hearing the word lump is not a positive word at all in the health arena. And most people are familiar with that. And so I come in there and, of course, we've been contending with health things for so long, and she's been on some medications that we knew had, malignancy was a risk, a side effect potentially. And so I walk in there and, it's kind of like a gun blast in the dead of night. I felt it deep within me. Like I wish maybe if I sit here a little while, maybe it'll be untrue. Maybe she didn't say that. Maybe I misheard her.
Right.
But I walked in there, and we were getting ready for 608, actually. And I remember what she was wearing. I remember the way the sunlight was coming into the room.
Isn't that crazy how God stops you so you can capture it all?
It's imprinted in my spirit. In my mind. And it was a beautiful day. And I went in there, and she showed it to me, and it was pretty significant size. It wasn't like, this might be a lump. It was like, man, this thing is, I don't know how long. She had told me in that moment, this has been here for a little while. I've been praying it would just go away. I didn't want to tell you. Yeah. And I don't think it, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, something like that.
Sure.
And so that was a moment of, we actually came to church that night, and John Weiss prayed over us after 608.
Yeah.
And the things that came next were, we needed the Lord more than ever, for sure.
Yeah. So you begin with some stuff, just the process of discovering what is this diagnosis. Like, can you walk through some of that? Because, sometimes there are people that, again, it's all different for every type of cancer,
sure,
and people, scenarios, and situations. But for you all, what was that like to go, all right, we see this mass. What did you do? What was the process of learning? What did you learn first, and kind of where did it progress?
Yeah, it was like drinking from a fire hydrant. Even for somebody who was coming from the medical field.
Sure.
So there's just lots of challenges for people, particularly those who maybe aren't medical and don't have a background in these kinds of things. And so, we jumped, right in. Thankfully or not positively, she had lots of relationships with doctors in Louisville already from her other battles with Crohn's and the blood clotting disorder. So we connected with them. They got us plugged into Baptist in Louisville. They immediately did a biopsy of the lump, and came back. They told us before we left that day there's a 5 to 6% chance this could be malignant.
That's it.
That's it. 5 to 6%.
That's it. So you're like, wow.
Yeah, we're like, man, we dodged a bullet.
Hey.
Thank you, Lord. And we drove home praising God for that good news.
Yeah.
But there was still that. There was always this sense of like a portent, like a harbinger. Kailen always knew that I was made to do hard things. She told me that on that sidewalk, and it was still true. God had told her that. And we drove home, and I could still see it, in her eyes a little bit. Like it was not gone. The 5 to 6% was not zero. In other words,
she wasn't relieved yet.
Not in the way that I was.
Yep.
No. I thought, well, these are, medically speaking, this is almost like a guarantee, pretty close.
Right.
And so about a week later, I get a knock on the door. I'm studying for block exams at this point, which is in pharmacy schools like a weekend full of tests, basically.
Yeah.
And so get a knock on the door. I go out there, look through the peephole, and it's Kim, Kailen's mom, and she's just weeping, like openly weeping. And I knew immediately it's another shot.
She had gotten this information before you all.
She did, yeah. And I'm not sure exactly how that happened, but she came to the door, and she and Jeff, Kailen's dad, were there, and Kailen came into the room. And I remember standing sort of in between her and her parents as they delivered the news to us, obviously through lots of tears. And I looked back at Kailen, and she just had this kind of grin on her face. It was like, I knew. You all didn't know yet, but I knew.
Yeah. And what they knew at this time was that it was malignant, right?
At this point,
it wasn't benign, it was malignant.
Correct. She did have some form of cancer. That's what we knew at that point.
Right.
In the weeks after that, they began to evaluate. We got a hematology-oncology appointment. They went in, did some additional testing.
Yeah.
And then a few weeks later, I think it was also a Sunday afternoon, believe it or not, we got a call from Dr. Williams, who
you are at home.
We're in our apartment in Lexington. We get a call, and I'm still studying, which is pretty much what I did all the time back then. And I hear Kailen in there on the phone, and I can pick up a word here or there, and I go in there and I look at her notes.
You went, oh, this is a different phone call.
It felt like, the tone was very clear that it was serious. I thought maybe something had happened with one of her family members or something like that. And I came in, and I think maybe she had it on speakerphone. But I just looked at her notes, and she had underlined the words "very bad." She just underlined those 2 or 3 times. And Dr. Williams had told her that the PET scan imaging they had done had revealed 3 or 4 metastatic spots in her bones, which essentially, means it was stage 4 at diagnosis, which even certainly then and even now is a very, very hard diagnosis. I mean, without the Lord's intervention, there's very little that can be done to keep it from being ultimately fatal. And so we knew, and I knew, Kailen certainly knew, that was a moment of great weight.
Yeah. You were studying cancer at the time, right?
Yes, it was.
You're in the middle of, right? Even just this topic as you're...
Yeah, that set of block exams was oncology therapeutics, which is,
grueling,
somewhat profound. Yeah, that felt that way, and so we were learning about the epidemiology and the prognosis and all these sorts of things. So I have all these biostatistics in my mind as I'm looking at my beloved, and very keenly aware of what this means.
She's 22, and they say what? They say they sometimes they don't always do this. Sometimes they're careful and cautious to do this, but they went on and gave you a time frame, right? What did they say?
So the average, and he was careful to say, this may not be the case for you,
sure.
And just like it's always a very subjective thing, but the average length of life beyond this particular diagnosis, given where your metastases are, is about 3 years. So at 22 years old, we knew best case scenario, we live out to our mid-20s, and that life we had dreamed of growing old together and having a family, and that began to evaporate pretty rapidly. Not that we gave up on it.
Sure.
We still prayed and believed and hoped, but we knew the medical reality we were facing said, this is aggressive.
Gosh, man.
Yeah, it's one of those things, a bend in the road. To put it mildly. We just, even when we knew it was cancer, like there's lots of. There are many forms of cancer that can be treated and cured surgically, or treated and cured with a first or second line of therapy.
Right.
And thankfully now, 10 years down the road, in the space that I work in, I get to see lots of people that do great.
Sure.
There's targeted therapies and things that were not around back then. But our options were fairly limited in 2012.
Yeah, I mean, as you're talking about this, I immediately just am living this picture-in-picture with my own wife, who's 20 years now, cancer-free, and a survivor.
Amen.
And flooded with just like it was yesterday. I mean, I remember the phone call, where I was, just like you were talking about. And there's probably a lot of people that are on this podcast that are either from the past, some situation with somebody that they love, or currently walking through this, and they're flooded as well with some of these memories. And so you shared in your notes with me, just even before, just give me a timeline. So you kind of walked me through some different things. And here's what it is. It says you're walking through just like when you guys met, when you married, and then you get to September 2012 to 2015, and then you just wrote the word war. And Talk about what those 3 years were like, because there's not a better term for it. What'd you guys do? How did God meet you guys in the middle of all that? What type of cancer treatments did you guys go after? What did all that look like for you all?
Sure. Yeah, in one of the books or maybe a blog post, I called it a marathon muck of barbarism, which is like a fancy way of saying it was really hard. You know, it was just really hard. And anybody who's listening who's going through these things right now, I'm just sorry for what you're enduring, because it is. Despite all of the medical advancements, it is just, there's no bumper sticker or newspaper article that can encapsulate how hard it really is, both as a patient and as a caregiver, to go through these kinds of things, as you well know. And so hundreds of days in the hospital, probably between 20 and 30 different hospitalizations across, Lexington, Louisville, but we spent a lot of time at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota.
Gotcha.
True godsend. Those clinicians up there were remarkable, and they were so kind to us and so brilliant, But we just went through this seemingly endless litany of surgery, chemo, radiation, repeat, and it was. One time I called it like the way we approach cancer is we barter with the disease.
Yeah.
We say, well, we'll take a breast off and give you 6 more months.
Yeah.
We'll take ovaries out and maybe give you another year.
Yeah.
In reality, what we're doing is we're trading actual life for the hope of life.
Yeah.
We're taking quality of life away for the hope of quantity.
Yeah.
And that's all you can do in the moment. Like, and every time they told us, well, we could do this, or they were like, let's do it. Let's whatever we can to give God more time to heal her, or give us more time together, more time to process, more time to, dream and hope. But as both of her, as her breast was removed, as she eventually had her colon removed as well, secondary to the Crohn's issue, and she had both of her ovaries taken out. She was bald for many years, as was I, and she just underwent. We probably took 10 or more different therapeutics, to try to, including many forms of chemo. The bone metastases were extraordinarily painful. Bone pain is a different beast, and it just. We had to radiate that as needed. And so she would go through standard protocols of radiation, but then she would also have to go in for spot treatment, just to sustain her. And the pain and pain medication, and, it kept her groggy. It limited, her brilliant mind. She was so smart and so talented in so many ways, but she just felt hindered by her body, and it just, and she was. And so this went on, like I said before, for about 3 years, and there was just countless ups and downs, the undulation of hope to hopelessness, to pain, to remission, to recurrence. These kinds of things are just the human mind and body are just exhausted by that process. And not only the patient, but also the caregivers. And within 6 months of starting chemotherapy, I was carrying her back and forth to the bathroom, and it was just, there were moments where I looked at my wife and all I could see was that carbon capsule that she lived inside. Like it was, her soul was not dimmed by these things,
right.
But her body was ravaged. And I'll touch on that more toward the end of our discussion, but it just was, war is what I titled that segment of our story, and it's simply put the only word that is sufficient. War is a horrific thing in every capacity, and there was really, not to say the Lord didn't do lots of wonderful work during that season, because He did, but it was an arduous path.
Tender places where as a new couple, man, think about this. This is stuff that, like, I was shocked in our 30s to have to walk through. I remember looking at the surgeon, and we're looking at surgery options, and we're going lumpectomy, single mastectomy, double mastectomy, and he's like, all we want is a lumpectomy. But I went, hey man, hold on, what would you do? And he goes, I'm like, no, man, listen, I'm not leaving until you tell me what you would do. You married? He's like, yeah. You got kids? He's like, yeah, I had a 20-month-old at the time. Go, no, man, listen, I'm not leaving until you tell me. What would you do? And he goes, I'd do a double mastectomy because I'm not trying to guard 5 years. I'm trying to guard 50. It was not what I wanted to hear, not certainly what my wife wanted to hear. And literally we leave that thing with lots of different, we got to pray through. And we get in the elevator and then we go down. When the elevator doors open up, my wife just collapses, you know. And you and I know something that if I could have traded her, and if you could have traded Kailen, you would have. But you can't. You're riding shotgun in a seat that you have zero control. And if you could take it away, you would, but you just can't, man. So kudos to you. Those aren't easy moments at all. But move us toward, you know, she passes away September 15, 2015. And talk about, if you're okay with this, just some of those tender moments, special moments, things that were significant to you all.
Yeah, there were many, and the Lord is kind, even when, you know, the Kailen's story was kind of called "Even If You Don't," you know, from Daniel 3, and you know, even if God doesn't, I'm still going to believe, and she proclaimed that broadly. So she was a great writer. She maintained
she blogged some,
right? She blogged, she blogged, and there was this whole team KCT, Kailen Combs Taylor, that really took off, and she did, you know, tender moments. There were so many of those. Like she was vibrant, you know, she was vibrant, and it was just she had bilateral hip fractures, meaning, you know, both hips broken or at least cracked. Okay. She had fractures in her spine. All of this comes from the cancer weakening the bone. But she got up in her hospital room and did this dance video to a song called "All About That Bass" by Meghan Trainor.
Yes.
And I don't necessarily advise you to listen to that song, but it was a very that video went viral throughout the hospital.
Did it?
And so we're on the cancer floor, of course, and there's patients down the hall. I can hear them listening to it on the phone.
Yeah.
And I'm just saying, man, that's infusing joy into a joyless place, and only the Spirit can do that. Only the Holy Spirit can do that.
Yeah.
And so that was a beautiful, funny, and tender moment. But one of the moments that I remember really, really clear, and I mentioned this to you when we were talking about the timeline. She had this dream in the hospital one time, and you know she was heavily sedated. You know, she was in so much pain, and by this point, unfortunately, the cancer had spread to her skull. You know, so there were metastases in her brain and her orbital bone and other places that were just horrible. But she had a dream, and she woke up and looked me straight in the eyes. I know she was lucid. I know it was true. And she said, I just saw what she simply called it the veil. Like the Lord just showed me a picture of the veil. It was white. It was glowing. It was very thin. She kept emphasizing it was very, very thin.
Yeah.
And I saw the Lord, and He said, you can come if you want to. Like you can go. And she said, and then I looked back, and you were standing there. And He said, he cannot come yet.
Yeah.
And she said, well, then I'm going to stay. You know, and she did. She came back from that. Yeah. We thought she was going to die then, but that was about maybe 6 months before. And so I know for sure that the Lord showed her that, you know, and eventually, of course, we know that she passed beyond that veil and was with Him physically. But, you know, those moments, what they did for my own walk with Jesus were obviously profound. They were very hard at the time. You mentioned blessings in the middle of it. A lot of people came to know Jesus because of Kailen's battle. You know, she shared her pain, her loss, her experience through her blog, and she did some speaking events and things like that. And she did silly things like dance in the middle of a terminal cancer diagnosis that you know, they're just countercultural. They're iconoclastic. They just don't make sense.
You can dance if you have hope.
Yeah, and she did. I mean, Anne Frank said, where there is hope, there is life.
Yeah, that's good.
And the Word essentially says that too. And it's just Kailen had hope all the way to the end.
You talked about some people coming to the Lord. What was the celebration? She had a celebration of life service. What was that like for you?
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways you probably go, I mean, you're there, but you're kind of not there. Mm-hmm. In some ways you're trying to be as in tune with everything that's going on. The Lord's comforting you, but just stories, anything that jumps out at you as you walk through that day?
Yep, yep. So I'll step back just one step to that final moment in the hospital room. And so her whole family was in there for a short time, like right before she passed, and we sang the doxology over her. And there was also Lauren Daigle was playing in the background. She has a song called "I Am Yours," and it's hard to listen to this day for me. But
I love Lauren Daigle.
Yeah, it's amazing, and Kailen did too. But I leaned down close to her, and I just remember saying, I'll be all right. You go be with the Lord. Like, you're free. Run to Him. You're free.
Yeah.
And within an instant, like, you could feel. If you've never, I'm sure, being in the ministry, you have.
I have.
Seeing the spirit leave someone, like her body was there, but she was not there, and you could feel it instantly. And it was
so much more than our bodies. Man.
Oh yeah. Amen. And she, those moments, those final moments with her, they gave me an opportunity. Dr. Williams came in, who at that point was a personal friend after 3 years of fighting the war together.
Of course.
And he allowed me to clean her body, before they took her away. And I just looked upon all these scars and scar tissue and wounds, and I just thought, man, she is fully whole and redeemed. Well. Yeah, the Lord has healed her. And so taking it, moving forward to the celebration of life, it really was a celebration. It was like, we know where she is. We know we're grieving, and and I would never be the same after that, quite the same. But it was a very public battle, and so the turnout to the celebration of life was huge. And that's not uncommon for a young loss like this. But in death, just like in life, the gospel was the center stage. Like that was I spoke and a couple other people spoke.
Buddy.
Man, it was hard. But the pastor, we made it very clear, like, we don't want to talk a ton about me or Kailen. Talk about Jesus. Talk about the gospel. Share it. And talk about how, like, she suffered and died, and so did Jesus. Like, and what He did for us makes this. We don't grieve without hope.
That's right.
Because of that. And amen. And so the one story that really sticks with me, I think several people came to know Jesus at the funeral, but there was one Muslim lady there who said, I remember her. I don't know if she talked to Kim or who she talked to, but she just basically said, I've never heard it mentioned this way or talked about this way. And to my understanding, she came to know the Lord.
That's awesome.
So praise God for that.
Hey, I want to take a moment here just to go through these pretty fast, but because I want to get to the greater parts of your story.
Sure.
But I want to zip through these, but I think we should talk about them. And that is funeral phrases.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Listen, we've all probably done stuff and said stuff, so I'm not trying to throw rocks at anybody or make anybody feel bad that's on the podcast that's listening. But here's the reality. In grief, we don't know what to do. We don't know what to say. And we want to say something that's meaningful. We want to feel good about what we said. We want to feel like it's helpful. And sometimes what happens is we slap a spiritual Band-Aid on somebody, and sometimes we do things that are really, really insensitive and disrespectful, and at times not even biblical. And so here's a few things, all right, locker room, that are maybe helpful to know as you walk through running into people who are dealing with extreme loss. And so here's some things that I would caution you to not say. And so here's a few, all right? Here's one. Many die young. At least they lived a long life. Not helpful. It's just not. Not after somebody's just passed away. Not after you're talking to a loved one. Sometimes we look for these silver linings with people, and they don't have to be. It's okay. Here's another one. He's in a better place. If they're 95 and they've been through a debilitating illness, sure, go for it. Say that. But if they're a baby or a child or a teenager or they're a young wife like you or a young dad or whatever, read the room. Don't say things like that. And the reality, hey, listen, we all know that. Everybody knows this. Heaven is a better place. If it's not, what are we doing, right? I mean, so heaven is a better place, but don't aim those words at a young mom or a father who just lost a baby or a child or a teenager or a newly married couple like yourselves. I've been married 30 years. And if I lost my wife today, I would not want someone to come to me and say, hey, man, she's in a better place. I wouldn't. I know that. I know that. And there's not a parent out there that wants to grieve their children regardless of age. Every parent wants to go on to heaven long before their kids ever do. Here's another one. And I don't know why this people say this, but people will say, hey, God just needed them. It's like, I don't even know really what that means, and it's biblically inaccurate. And God doesn't need us, by the way. Everybody, you need to know this. God doesn't need us. He's very secure about himself and very happy about who he is. He loves us. He wants to be in relationship with us. And he's also not bound by space and time, which means he can be connected to us regardless of where we are. The fact that we're bound by time, he's still connected to us. And so he doesn't need to go, you know what, I just really miss them, or I would like to be with them. So he's going to reach down into our lives and pluck us out to get us to the next life because he just needed us. It's not true. Here's another weird one. She accomplished what she had come to do, and it was just her time. How do we know that? And by the way, you know, that person was 8 years old or 25 years old. You know, how do we know? We just don't know things like that. Or this one's, I've heard this before too. God needed another angel, and it's like, you know, this is I heard this at my brother's funeral a number of times, and he was not an angel, nor am I an angel. Angels are different, and they're part of God's creation, but we are different. Human beings, mankind is different than angels. God has thousands and thousands of angels. The Bible doesn't say anywhere in the Scriptures that when we pass away that we enter into glory with new bodies, and they're angelic bodies. We just get new bodies, and so let's not say things that aren't biblical. Here's some really insensitive things, and I'll just kind of throw these in the bottom of the junk drawer. But hey, at least you still have another kid. At least you were able to have kids. Or, hey, you're young and good looking. You can get remarried. Or someone who just says, hey, I just want you to be strong. Why? We don't have to say things just because we're saying things. Why be strong? We need to be really careful to steward those moments in a way that God is honored and that people feel loved and seen and cared for. And so any others that jump out to you?
Those are all good ones. I have called funeral phrases, you know, they're the cliches that rescue us from awkward silences and keep the line moving. That's what it is.
That's perfect.
And it's not. They're all well intentioned.
Sure.
You know, they're people that love you, and so you hit a lot of the big ones. You know, you'll see them again someday. Is one that we know is true.
Yeah.
That one's biblically accurate. One that I got a lot is now you have a new purpose in life. And it's like, well, I mean, my purpose is the same as it was before, biblically speaking.
Yeah.
I have new circumstances, you know.
That's it.
But you know, we talk about ministry of presence. You know, I've written some things about that, about how to love a grieving person well. And a lot of times it's just, you know, the most important or the most valuable thing anybody ever told me was Kailen's Uncle Jay, who was a very soft-spoken guy, didn't say a lot.
Yeah.
One night, it was late, been a terrible day. We were at a hospital in Louisville. I don't remember which one. And I got a text from him, and thankfully I got a lot of texts from a lot of great people.
Yeah, right.
But Jay sent me just 2 sentences. He said, I have nothing for you, brother. I'm sorry, and there's food for you in the hallway.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, that's the most meaningful text message I could have received in that moment. He's like, I've got nothing for you. I love you. Here's some food. Yeah. And he was, I don't know that he even knows that. You know, if he hears this, it might catch him off guard. But it just meant the world to me.
Yeah, what am I going to say to you, man, that's just going to make it go away? Nothing.
Yeah. Nothing.
Not a thing, you know? Telling people you're sorry. Telling people you love them. Tell them that you're here.
Yeah.
Hey, and it's okay. Gary said this as well. Hey, I don't know what you're going through, you know, but I'm here to help in any way that I can. It's okay to say that, you know, how that loved one impacted your life in a good way. Just use discretion, you know, and don't spend forever. You're going to have moments beyond the visitation or the funeral to be able to do that. And so be mindful of that. I had another one of those moments. When my brother was killed, he was 27, and I heard all the stupidest things. And again, I know people mean well, but it's like, man, you can be so hurtful to people. But there's this guy named Dave Hastings who came up, and I'm standing in front with my mom and my dad who are divorced and remarried. I'm up there just trying to greet and make sure everybody's okay. And he gets up and says, he looks at my dad and says, Danny, I love you. I'm so sorry for your loss of your son. And I wish there was something that I could say, just like her uncle, but I know I can't. I just want you to know that I'm here, and we'll give you a little time, then I'll follow up with you. And then he said, one thing I will tell you, Danny, God knows what it's like to lose a son. He said, lean into him and let him love you. And I appreciated those words so much. And it's weird, my brother's 27, you're Kailen was 25. I mean, you can feel like God's not for you or something's happened in this moment, and the enemy would love to get inside of that and go, hey, don't run to him. Don't run to him. If he was for you, he would never let this happen. And that's just not true. The Bible just gives over and over clarity of, hey, we live in a world that is undone and is in need of redemption. We live between the cross and the crown, all those things. And so any other helpful things, I think we kind of hit this, anything else that you think of just as it relates to positive, healthy things that you can do for people?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit it.
Okay.
It's a ministry of presence, not saying something that, just to fill a void.
Yeah.
We got to get comfortable with just being present, silent. If there's nothing to say, don't say it.
Yeah, that's good. So here's the crazy things. As you're walking me through the story, just in detail, last week when we were talking, I looked at you and said, hey, you were a 26-year-old widower. That's almost never said, man. Mm-hmm. Ever, ever. Grief is a challenge. It doesn't come natural to us. We don't know how to do it. For men, it's even more challenging for us because we're always trying to figure out how to connect the dots emotionally and do that rightly. But there's healthy and unhealthy ways to grieve and navigate loss. And so give us a couple of things that you did really well to navigate grieving well, and then a couple of things that you didn't do well.
Sure, yeah. So the healthy things, one of them was exercise. I kept my body physically moving. I didn't. I did lose a lot of weight because I didn't eat a lot, but I was exercising and keeping my physical health in a good place. I also read a lot. I've always been a reader, and that included the Word, most importantly. I never left the Word. Yeah. As I'll talk about in a minute, I did leave church for a while, but I never left. I never left the Word. And then lastly, writing was, I put that one in bold just because it was a source of healing and catharsis for me that ultimately God turned into a ministry platform. Yeah. And I, he put that passion in my heart, and it was a very healthy coping strategy, healing strategy for me. On the unhealthy side, I mentioned it a little bit in the book, and even if you don't, but about drinking. Alcohol was, it wasn't a daily thing, but it was a warm anesthesia, is what I phrased it. It was like it dulled it just enough to where 1 or 2 nights a week or whenever it was, I used it as a sedative. I used it as a crutch, and that wasn't healthy, and at times it was sinful. I isolated. That was an unhealthy thing without question. We need community to heal. Yeah. God designed our hearts for that. He designed our minds for that.
It's exactly what the enemy wants us to do, is isolate.
It is. Yeah, he wants you to feel
help and hope. And
if he can get you in a corner on an island, he can beat you. And if you're with other brothers and sisters in Christ, he cannot. And so I kind of receded from church a little bit, which is unfortunately a common thing for people who are actively grieving. But that was not healthy, and it did not ultimately help me. Once I got back in church, it was a much healthier thing. Yeah. And then we'll kind of get to this in a minute, but what came later was intense anger. And not so much about my loss of Kailen, but about the loss of my life after she was gone. Yeah. And we'll talk a little about that. But those are some of the healthy and unhealthy.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned writing here. Obviously you mentioned Kailen had a blog and she would write on it. You blogged after she passed away. And then you started, we'll talk about your books here in a second, but I think I told you this the other day. It's like at the very beginning of the year, you hear these challenges like New Year, and all these different things. Working out, reading, hard, whatever it is, 75 hard or whatever it is. You do all these different things, and it's interesting how writing has become one of those things now, and it's targeted toward men, and I think it's really healthy. I mean, it's one of those things. I'm trying to challenge guys in Fight Club and different places where they'll get a journal, and in that journal you can write out prayers, you can write down things that you've got going on, things that you're struggling with, things that God's teaching you, places where you're winning. It's not like your diary, it's none of that. But what happens when we write, and again, I have the luxury of doing this, and you've picked this up as well, but there's something amazing that happens in it. When you write, you have to, it causes you to reflect and dig out what's on the inside, and it slows you down to process. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, man. There maybe the Holy Spirit's out of this challenging guys just to create some space once a month or every couple of weeks, just to jot some things down. Just how am I doing? How am I feeling? What's going on? What do I see God do? I don't know what that is, but there's something valuable in writing. And so you write 2 books, and 2018, less than 3 years later, your first book is called Even If You Don't, a love story, which is the title of this podcast. And then 2020, your second book, The Lazarus Within. Talk about the distinction between these two books. Talk about the titles. Give us a little bit of understanding about kind of where you went with these books.
Sure, yeah.
Because you're grieving and then you're writing about it in the midst of it, right?
Yeah, and it was healing from the standpoint of, number one, I enjoy writing and it's cathartic for me by nature, but I had to relive everything in devastating detail, particularly for Even If You Don't, which is written more like a novel. It's just pure story. It's just our love story, and it was from beginning to end, started here at Southland. I think the first chapter is here at Southland. Yeah. And the last chapter is me standing next to the gravestone, and it tells the story. It's simple as that, just pure narrative, much like a novel might be.
Gotcha.
But Even If You Don't was a very, very significant phrase to Kailen. Daniel 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Yeah. There's a song by, I think, Shane and Shane, Though You Slay Me, and there was a sermon by John Piper that got interspersed into that about how our pain is not meaningless, and yet I will praise him even if he doesn't heal me or even if he doesn't save me from this or that. Yeah. And she ultimately had "Yet I will praise him" tattooed on her forearm. Yeah. And it was this idea of even if he doesn't, I'm still going to believe and ask and expect miracles. She was just this resilient faith, and it defined her, and it ultimately made her story incredibly magnetic for people all over the world because they saw, whether they knew it or not, they saw Jesus, in her story. Yeah. And so I got the privilege, sincere privilege, of telling her story. It was like the Lord handed it to me and said, "You were born to do this.
Go tell it.
Yeah. Go tell this story." Yeah. And he equipped me to do that, and praise him for that. The second book was more of by genre, quote unquote, self-help. It was more about life after loss. How do we cope with a lot of the topics you and Gary talked about, with how do we handle grief, how do we handle loss, and how do we rediscover life after it? How do we live meaningfully beyond a devastating event like a cancer diagnosis and a cancer-related death,
Gotcha.
Particularly of a spouse or a child or somebody very close to you. Yeah. To sort of segue us, like you included a quote or one of the quotes from the back of the book. My wife's death was like the detonation of a grenade on a snow-covered peak. We knew it was coming, but in the end, it wasn't that explosion that killed us. It was the avalanche afterward.
That's. I mean, it's so clear. It's not just the explosion; it's what happens. It's the avalanche that comes.
Yeah,
it's great. It's great. Shift gears to something that you didn't anticipate as quickly as it would happen. I'm sure you weren't even thinking about all this, but all of a sudden you reconnect with a woman named Erin. Again, you mentioned her that she introduced you and Kailen, and then she's now your current wife. And so talk about how you knew her. How did you get reconnected, the beginnings of your relationship, and then this takes a really weird turn, a hard turn for you. Mm-hmm. Talk about that.
Yeah. It that quote I just shared about the avalanche, like that, I did not see it coming. I did not see it. I mean, I thought the worst was over, frankly. I mean, who wouldn't think that? So Erin, she introduced Kailen and I, at this point
she was dating one of your friends.
She dated one of my friends and was even engaged to him for a short time. And they had been broken up for about a year, 6 months to a year when Kailen died.
She was in your wedding too, right?
She was a bridesmaid in our wedding. Yeah. And she had just been a good friend, a good Christian friend for 10 to 12 years. Yeah. We went to college together. And so she was just, to be honest, it just started off with, we both lived in Frankfurt still. I still lived in the house that Kailen had died in, essentially. Yeah. And Erin lived across town. And, she was just really kind to me. Yeah. Like, she brought me food every now and then. She would send me passages of scripture or a quote from a song that she thought, hey, this will encourage him.
Sure.
And she was just very kind. And then we both had dogs, and so I think it was actually a Sunday morning, maybe early, we went out to this park in Frankfurt and just walked the dogs, and we took a devotional book, and we were just going to do some reading out there, maybe individually. And it started absolutely pouring rain. We're like 200 yards from the car, and she just started laughing, really joyfully laughing. And I looked at her in that moment, and I've told her this since then. She probably had no idea at that time. But I looked at her, and I suddenly saw her very differently. It was like I need somebody who can laugh in the rain, because my life is a storm, man.
Yeah.
My life had been ravaged by a hurricane, and here's somebody who is beautiful and so kind and smart and knows Jesus and is laughing in the middle of this, and we're getting drenched. Our devotional's drenched and pretty well ruined. The dogs need a shower, just all these things. And it's just like she was laughing in the face of that. And ultimately, in the weeks and months that followed, years that followed, she would laugh in the face of much more significant rain.
Yeah.
And she's just, to be honest with you, she's the most Christ-like person I've ever known.
Yeah.
She is more like Jesus than anybody that I get to do life with.
Yeah.
I get to do life with lots of amazing people.
Yeah.
But Erin saved my life. Yeah. I mean, she didn't necessarily, I wasn't thinking of harming myself or anything like that, but she saved the meaning and the purpose of my life by tethering me back to reality.
You're in a pit.
Yes. Yeah. I was wandering aimlessly around the world, and I wrote one time, a stranger in a strange place, a broken and unwanted thing.
Yeah.
And she reoriented me to truth and refused. I've said she stood in the gap and refused to move. She was a friend that stood by, to quote Gary's poem that he shared last time.
Yeah.
And she refused to move, no matter what. And she put up with a lot for me. I mean, I'm talking about a lot.
Yeah. So, and the put up stuff that you end up dealing with is people have opinions because you've been, this happened not that long ago. You're dating, and people have lots of thoughts. They have lots of expertise about things that they've never been a part of. And so, talk about some of that.
Yeah. It's probably, I mean, in a story like this, it's hard to say what is quote unquote hardest.
Yeah.
But it was probably the most traumatic part of my story, because
these are friends and family,
very close people. Yeah, people I was very close to, and I was already wounded. Obviously, I just lost my wife, and
of course.
And I thought, the Lord has given me this another amazing person that's in my life, and we eased into it. We thought, these feelings are real. We want to
weren't headhunting. You weren't getting on a dating app. There's none of that.
It just was a very organic, seemingly Lord-led experience with her, and we very kind of gently broke the news to key people here, there, and the response was just extraordinarily negative. We experienced blowback in nearly every sense of the word, and we lost. I mean, I lost pretty well all my friends, more or less. Like anybody that was mutual friends with me, Kailen and Erin especially, pretty well exited stage right. And it was, some of them were pretty acidic and pretty ugly.
Sure.
And I've come to find out in the years since that it was not unique to me.
Yeah.
It's something a lot of people deal with.
Yeah. Some things that stick out as we're thinking about this is you've been grieving longer than anybody. I mean, in some ways, you knew once this was beyond that 5 to 6% that it was malignant. Mm-hmm. And Kailen's looking at you going, I told you, this is my story, and you're part of it. This is our story now. This was coming. So you began to grieve way ahead of everybody else. Hopeful, obviously, but you know what? Going, this is, unless the Lord intervenes, this is where this is all going to lead. I talked with Gary, a month ago on the podcast. Everybody grieves differently, different ways, different time frames. 5 stages of grief. They're not steps or stages. Not everybody goes through all of them. Another thing is married couples that experience the painful, debilitating illnesses or terminal cancer. They have conversations, significant ones, about their wishes. Not everybody does, but some people do, and they end up before they pass away, they have conversations about this stuff. My wife's uncle, Andy, in particular, I mean, his wife had battled 5 different types of cancers, and they had been grieving long before this. He got remarried pretty quickly. A lot of people were pretty shocked by it. And to be honest with you, Debbie's amazing, and he knew what he needed, and God knew what he needed, and he provided another person who put in his path. It just happened to be quicker than what people thought. And so some of the feedback was, hey, this is quicker than we thought. Some of it was, oh my gosh, this is somebody that you all knew and they were friends. And so it's like, well, in some ways you go, well, where do I go? Mm-hmm. Do I have to go out of state? Is there a perimeter? Is there, those type of things. And so, and here's the other piece of this. And it doesn't matter whether it's grief or you're dealing with addiction or anything, that if you'll put enough attention towards something, whatever it is, you can move the ball down the field. And again, I'm not saying that you can microwave grief. You cannot. You can't microwave an addiction moving toward freedom. But man, if you will put the right pieces in place, the right relationships, the right spiritual disciplines, the right practices, man, things can grow. And for you, it was just you. You guys didn't have kids. You weren't having to kind of help them walk through things. It was you trying to figure this out. And so, anything in that this is, as we're talking about this stuff, anything that jumps out at you that you go, yeah, and this is helpful probably to say because you've mentioned this. There are plenty of other couples that have walked down this road.
Yes. For me, it's about grief timelines. You touched on it already. Grief, and the core truth there is that grief is a response to loss, even if it's perceived loss, even if it's not actual loss yet, not death. And so for me, I began grieving on September 12th, 2012. Many of my friends and family, not all, but many of them began grieving on September 15th, 2015.
Yeah.
And so
3 years, 3 days later.
3 years and 3 days later.
Yeah.
And so whenever I developed feelings for Aaron, it caught me off guard, but it did not feel instantaneous. Right. Whereas for them, it felt like, man, this is super quick.
Yeah.
And so the grief timeline piece, the fact that it's a response to loss and not death, that's a key distinction for people to remember, not only those who are grieving, but those who are loving someone who's grieving, particularly a romantic loss like a spouse.
Sure, yeah. And this could be, sometimes Christians, we do our best because we're careful, protective, we mean well, but then we can be critical if we're not careful about things that we've not necessarily walked through. And so, whether that's somebody who's just walked through a divorce, whether that's somebody that has had a loss like you have, somebody that even have kids that have made some really painful decisions, bad decisions, or kind of off the rails. If we're not careful, we can be overly critical about them. We become experts in things that we maybe haven't ever even walked through. And so I need to be careful of that. And so we all need to be mindful. And listen, if you have a question, move back toward them with a lot of love and a lot of grace to get understanding. But be careful just to not sit back. Be more prayerful and less critical. And if you're concerned, move toward them, ask good questions. Don't stand back and gossip, Pretend that you know what it's like to be in their shoes, because that's not the case. So, some verses around some of this stuff I think is helpful. Ecclesiastes 3, 1-4. There's a time for everything, Solomon says. A season for every activity under the sun. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to tear down, a time to build up, a time to weep, and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance. Just as I read that verse, what comes to mind? I immediately thought about Kailen dancing.
Or dancing.
Yeah.
We live in a physical world with physical realities. It's a fallen realm, but we don't face them alone. I mean, the Word is adamant over and over again that He's with us, and we can face each of these times, these seasons of life, with joy and hope because of that. Yeah. And Kailen did that as well as anybody I know. And I think that's the reason that God has continued to use her life to further the kingdom even after she's gone.
That's good. Proverbs 13:12, this may be a verse that people go, I don't know what it is until I say the words. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life. Mm-hmm. Anything in that?
There is so whenever you first shared this verse or mentioned it, I just thought, man, there's a perfect story for that. Viktor Frankl tells this story from the Auschwitz concentration camp. Yeah. One of his he was a prisoner there. Yeah. One of his fellow prisoners had typhoid fever really severely. That was a very common thing. And he was on his deathbed, essentially. Mm. One night he had a dream that the American liberation was coming exactly 3 weeks to the day from that moment. Wow. So over the next 3 weeks, this man makes a full recovery without medicine. So no medical intervention. All he has is hope. Yeah. Hope is driving his cure. Yeah. The day comes, the American liberation does not come. Within 48 hours, he regresses and dies. Mm. And it's hope deferred does make the heart sick. Yeah. The power of hope is resurrecting. I mean, it truly can heal.
Yeah. I give this verse in here because, again, we think that we know things and we don't always know, and the Lord has different plans often. But it's Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. It says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, my thoughts more than your thoughts." And that could be anywhere around the diagnosis of what happened and have no idea why. It could be even the fact that, months later, you end up in front of your now second wife. We have no idea sometimes. God's plans are just so different. Anything that you want to say about that passage?
Kailen's dad, Jeff, said it as well as anybody I've ever heard. He just said we walk up to the edge and bow to the mystery of what the Lord has. We bow to that. We submit to the things we don't understand. And there are many.
That's good.
There are many.
Joel 2:25-27. Some of us have heard this verse, but it says, "I will repay you for the years the locusts have eaten." The great locust and the young locust, the other locust and the locust swarm. My great army I will send among you. You will have plenty to eat until you are full. You will praise the name of the Lord your God, who has worked wonders for you. Never again will my people be ashamed. Then you will know that I am Israel and I am the Lord your God, that there is no other. Never again will my people be ashamed. Anything in that, just as you're thinking about your life, because you went from this is the love of your life, this is all you want to do, and then 5 years later it's all, and then all of a sudden you're with your wife now. God's just restored those years. Talk about that.
It's true in every aspect of my life, and all the credit and the glory and the praise are His. I can look at, obviously my marriage and my children are the preeminent thing that come to mind, but also we had a scorched earth social landscape after we started dating. There was nothing left. It was burnt to the ground. And I joined a Southland group in January of 2020. And I met this group of guys in Georgetown, and then that group grew, and we split and became two groups, and I now lead one of those groups. Yeah. My wife joined a group with those guys' wives, and all of a sudden we live in community with this amazing group of people. It was like we had a good group of friends before,
sure,
but nothing ever like what we have now. And it's just an abundant, restoration of what was taken.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah. This last part, just some practical wisdom around navigating loss and grief. I'll start by just saying I think we need a good theology when it comes to death, because I don't know why, but we forget. And we want to shush it away. We don't want to talk about it, la, la, la. We would rather not think about it. And the reality is death's part of the story. It's why people refuse to go visit their loved ones who are in nursing homes, because they can't see them that way. And it's like, yeah, but this is they're still here. And God is not done with them, and He's not done with their story. He's not done with what He wants to do in our time together. And so we love people in spite of this, of what they look like or what they have going on. And the reality is death is 100%. 1 in 1, people die. Unless Jesus comes back, we're all going to lose people that we love. And the reality is, if we live long enough or another breath, there's a good chance that we're going to die. And that fall, it's going to be in other people that care about us. To circle back, just theologically, death is a result of sin in the Garden of Eden. It's a part of the fall. It's a consequence of sin. And I'm zipping forward, just moving fast. There's so much that we could say about this, but the bloodstained cross and the empty tomb communicate that Jesus has come to defeat Satan, sin, and death. And so we don't have to be afraid of it. In fact, Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 15:55 through 57. He says, "Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?" Because of Jesus and what He's done. And Jesus reminds us of the clarity about His second coming, the hope of eternal life in John 14. Hey, you don't have to be afraid. In this room, in this house has many rooms. If that weren't so, I wouldn't tell. I'm going there, but I'm coming back, but I'm going to prepare a place for you. And here's the point: we're all going to die. We don't have to freak out about it. This life isn't it. Jesus came to destroy the power of sin and death in our lives. John 15, Lazarus, the whole reality says, Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life. Even though they die, they're going to live." Do you believe this? That's a $1 million question. And that's hope. Hope that moves us beyond whatever's going through, whatever's going to happen to us, whatever diagnosis we're even dealing with today. And so as I say this, I'm not trying to be insensitive to anybody. If you have just been walking through a hard season, or your body's beginning to fall apart, or it's betraying you, just say a prayer, rub some dirt on it. I'm not telling you to deny your feelings. What I am saying is that God's given us great promise and great perspective around this topic. The enemy would love to leverage this in our lives, to keep us stuck, to get us afraid, to keep us from grieving. And that's not God's intentions at all. So we have to stay anchored in God's truth, held together by His presence, and motivated by the hope that we have in Him. Anything you want to jump in and just say there? I know I've kind of moved us pretty quickly down the road.
Yeah,
but.
I mean, obviously you touched on the theology of death, and the Word is it's hope fueled.
Yeah.
We have a different perspective on it than those who don't know the Lord.
Right.
And so when I go, visit Kailen's grave, which I don't do super often, partly because I know she's not there. It's just it's a symbol, and it's a great place to process grief. But
everybody does it differently. Some people love doing that.
Yeah, and that's perfectly fine. Whatever works for you. I just know, because of what the Word says,
Yeah.
I can be at peace knowing, the truth.
That's right.
And I don't have to fear my own death. I don't have to fear the death of other loved ones, because there is secondary grief and all these things that come after you have one major loss. There's a tendency to fear it, and we don't have a spirit of fear and timidity.
Yeah.
The Word says that's not what He gave us.
Yeah.
And that's because ultimately what Jesus did, like you said.
You mentioned this earlier. It comes out of Paul's words, 1 Corinthians 4:13-14. It says, "And now, dear brothers and sisters, we want you to know what will happen to the believers who have died, so you will not grieve like people who don't have hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and was raised to life again, we also believe that when Jesus returns, God will bring back with him the believers who have died." And so what that's saying is, hey, we should grieve. We should absolutely grieve as believers in Christ for the people that we care about and that we've lost in this life, but we don't have to grieve as people who don't have hope. That's something completely different. And basically, Paul's going, hey, remember the bloodstained cross. Remember the tomb. Remember that first Easter Sunday morning when Jesus came back to life. The reality is, if that doesn't happen for Jesus, it won't happen for us. But if it happened for Jesus, it will happen for us. And so it reminds me of the story of Rich Mullins. Rich Mullins was a great Christian artist, especially when I became a believer. He's since been gone, but lots of different songs that he sang. But back in the day, he was touring overseas, and it was late. He'd already had a show, and there was a knock on his door, and I think it was his manager who basically had gotten word that his grandmother passed away. And he's like, "Hey, man, I hate to share this with you, but I just found out that your grandmother passed away." And Rich looked at him just really quickly and went, "Good for her." Mm-hmm. And then he closed the door. And he wasn't trying to be insensitive. He wasn't denying his own feelings. Rich Mullins was just anchored in the hope that comes from knowing Jesus. He knew that, man, that's not goodbye. Mm-hmm. This is see you later. And he's anchored to the promises of the hope that we have that is eternal, that God is better and heaven is better than this life that we're in. And so it's important for us to have a good theology around death, and also the hope that comes from the resurrection. And so that's why I love the fact that he says, "Good for her." A couple other verses, and you mentioned this the other day in conversation. I'll just mention it, these two, and then you can share anything that you want to. But 2 Corinthians 4:17, it says, "For our light and momentary troubles." This is Paul. He's talking about what he's going through, and he's talking about the things that we go through. He says, "For our light and momentary troubles," which don't feel light or momentary. Yeah. He says, "are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." He's basically saying, hey, put all the hard that we're going through, all of that on one side of the scale, and put this glory that we have that's promised for us, put them on a scale, and watch what happens when he says that this far outweighs that. And then the second one is, Paul also says this, 2 Corinthians 2:9, "No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind can conceive what God has in store for those who love him." And so, locker room, listen, unless Jesus comes back, something's going to happen at some point. We're going to get some bad news, or we're just not going to wake up in our sleep. We're going to wake up and our eyes are going to be open in glory. That's just the reality. We have to have a good theology around death and a good theology of hope, which comes from the resurrection. Anything you want to add to that before we get into some of these big critical pieces around grief?
And just that Kailen always referred to that as grand scheming it. So she would say, "I'm going to grand scheme this," know. And
dig that out. When you say that, what do you mean?
Yeah. So she would put it within a heavenly or eternal perspective. Yeah. So she knew she wouldn't say it out loud necessarily. She didn't want to speak, death over herself, but she knew more than likely she was going to die young, and we all knew that. But she knew, like C.S. Lewis said, you don't have a soul, you are a soul, you have a body.
That's good.
And her body was decaying. It was falling apart, but her soul was eternal.
Yeah.
And she tried to live from the soul perspective, the grand scheme perspective of eternity, as opposed to focusing on, man, I got to go to another radiation, or more than likely this is going to come back, or whatever it might have been, and ultimately I'm going to die. I've often thought, we're all one heartbeat away.
Yeah.
So technically speaking,
we're all terminal.
Yes. Someone with stage 4 cancer, or somebody that's in the world's eyes perfectly healthy, are the same distance from eternity.
Yeah.
And so it's grand scheming. It makes a lot of sense in that context.
That's good. All right, let's dig out some wisdom just around grief, application around hope. You mentioned this: grief is not a response to death; it's a response to loss. Talk about that.
Yeah, that distinction is so vital, I think, because of the fallout that it precipitates, in the lives of the survivor in particular. We we think that grief begins when something actually dies, but that's just not the case. And I know you and Gary talked about the loss of something in life, a job or a dream unrealized. These things, we grieved the mother she would never be to the children we would never have. No one died, but a hope, a potentiality died,
and unmet expectations, what you thought your life was going to be.
Yes, and that is so important because of what it does for the person who, like in my case, the person who continued on living. You don't move on, you just keep going. You don't have a choice. You got to keep going. And that's partly because or that the fact that grief is not a response to death but loss is very important in that context.
There's guilt that can come with grief, and you mentioned 6, and I was so this is really insightful. And so, will you talk about just those how guilt can show up in our grief? Talk about those 6 different areas. Just kind of hit them quickly.
Sure. Yeah, grief-related guilt. So this was transformative for me when I found these. I did a lot of reading during my period of really intense grief. 6 kinds that are kind of standard 6. There's probably others, but the ones that are standard in the literature are role guilt, which is guilt in the belief you didn't serve your God-appointed role well. Say it was a child and a mother feels like they were not a good mom.
Sure.
In my case, it might have been a husband, falling short as a husband. Moral guilt, which is the belief that you did something morally wrong, some sin of your past or something that caused that diagnosis. You somehow earned this problem. Causation is more direct, like you made a mistake actively, or you did or did not do something you should have done, and as a result, this happened.
Like in a treatment situation.
Yes. So there's times when, like, we decided to do a treatment as opposed to a surgery, and the results were negative, and I was part of that decision, so I feel some causation guilt because of that decision.
It's easy 2020, look backwards. It's real clear, right?
Yeah, for sure. The retrospective is much clearer than moving forward. And of course, the enemy will use that against you.
Completely.
The two of the really important ones that aren't talked about a lot is grief guilt and recovery guilt, which are kind of 2 sides of the same coin. So grief-related guilt is the belief, guilt that comes from the belief that you're grieving too harshly, too severely, or for too long. And so, like...
Isn't that crazy? The enemy will use that, going, hey, man, you're stuck in this, and he loves it,
Yep. And if he can convince you that you're grieving too long or inappropriately, he can convince you of a lot of these other things. Role guilt, for instance. Like if you have grief guilt, you could very easily begin believing, well, I'm not a good husband to my current wife because I'm still grieving my first wife, or a parent situation, whatever it might be. Recovery guilt is the exact opposite, and it's the one that I've contended with most profoundly, which is the belief that you recovered too quickly and that you're grieving because, man, everybody's telling me I was too fast, so I must be, and so, like, I must have not really loved her, or I must have had these plans all along. And we know those are lies from Satan, and we certainly call them as such or identify them as such, but they can feel very real in the midst of it. And then the 6th one is one probably most people have heard of. It's a little more common. It's survivor guilt, which is simply the idea, why am I still alive when my loved one is gone? And a lot of people from, really significant events like a mass shooting or something horrible like that survive, feel that.
Why am I still here?
Yeah, pretty poignantly. Yeah.
You mentioned 2 books, to me, C.S. Lewis books, The Problem with Pain. And you talk about this quote, it's not the load that breaks you, it's the way that you carry it. Mm-hmm. That's a strong statement. It's not the load that breaks you, it's the way that you carry it. And then you mentioned Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. He says, how you carry grief is a choice. Mm-hmm. Talk about just why those 2 statements are critical as we're talking about this topic.
Yeah, the reason I think both of those are so important to me is they kind of, I interpret them the exact same way. So, like C.S. Lewis, for instance, one of my very favorite writers, it's not the load that breaks you down, semicolon, it's the way you carry it.
Yeah.
At the semicolon is a choice.
Yeah.
So you get to choose how you carry it.
Yeah.
Nobody's forcing you to carry it one way or the other.
Yeah.
Ultimately, that falls with you, and that's exactly what Frankl was saying is, you can't control the circumstances that befall you in life, period. Like, these things are going to happen, and they're not up to you. They're up to a higher power.
Right.
But you do get a choice in how you respond to your circumstances.
Yeah.
And he, again, he was in Auschwitz concentration camp, and he talked very plainly about those who carried the pain, the loss, the grief, the hurt differently were the ones that survived.
That's good.
In a physical sense, but also maybe even in a spiritual and moral sense. And so the fulcrum of it is a choice.
Yeah.
And that's a hard reality when you're in acute stages of grief, and you don't necessarily have to focus on that all the time.
Yeah.
But we can choose hope because of Jesus,
That's good.
and ultimately that's the point of those quotes.
Man, last thing, instead of me just kind of walking us all the way through all of this, I just thought I'd rather leave some space, 5, 7, 8, 9 minutes, just for you to share 3 or 4 things that Jesus has taught you, critical things that are game changers for people that are walking through grief and loss that are beneficial for a locker room audience to hear. So I'm going to sit back and let you just run this race with us. Help us know kind of what you're thinking.
Well, it's a privilege and an honor to share these things because the Lord has shared them with me out of His kindness and generosity, and the fact that He has never left me, not for a moment, in the midst of it. Even though there were plenty of times where I maybe lost sight of Him, it felt like it, But I just pulled out 3 bullet points, and that's a simplistic distillation of all that I've learned in the last now approaching 10 years since her passing, which is hard to fathom. But the first one is just that no amount of agony is enough to dim His love for you. And so no matter how ragged the race has made you, He is still there. I mean, the Word is true, and there's just a quick story that I'll share about that. And one of the things that's kind of inherent to that is even if He doesn't take away your pain, He does understand your pain. He knows about it and He cares about it. And I was in the hospital with Kailen, laying on one of those couch beds that you can't really sleep on.
Terrible.
Pretty terrible. It had been a really hard night. Dr. Williams and his team came through at 4:30 in the morning on rounds. Kailen, thankfully, graciously, was still asleep. And he told me, hey, it was kind of the next set of bad news. He said, we've got metastases in her face now, unfortunately, and she had swelling above her, I think it was her left eye. And he said, we're going to have to radiate it, and it's not good. It's a next step toward the end, essentially. And as I laid there, she didn't wake up for 2 or 3 more hours. And as I laid there, I watched the sun rise over Louisville, and I really felt the Lord. I can't really honestly recall if it was audible or just inside my heart. But He said, don't envy me. And it took me a while to understand why God would have said that to me. But I think what He was saying, and it has become more pronounced as I've gone on in the years to follow, was that you're waking up this morning to this sunrise carrying a really heavy weight. You're about to have to break the news to your wife that she's having another major recurrence. That is how I approach every dawn. Every dawn. I've borne the weight.
I knew this before you.
Way before I was even born. He knew that moment would come, and he bore the weight of all of that on the cross. And don't envy me. In other words,
really
hey, I understand, my son. I understand, and I'm sorry, but I'm with you. And no amount of agony or the perception of isolation.
That's good, man.
Should be able to convince you of the truth that He won't leave or forsake you. That's what He tells us, and it's true. The second bullet is if you make your pain available to God, He won't waste it. And that's
great.
It's not meaningless. It's not meaningless. Inherent in that is a choice, and you have to choose to make it available to Him. But as a good Father, He doesn't require a whole lot. Like if you make it available at all, He can amplify it beyond our wildest, immeasurably more. And so I sat down at my computer one morning, cup of coffee, probably feeling pretty miserable at the time. 2 or 3, 5, 6 months after she passed, and just pecked out some, a portion of the story. And the Lord was like, keep going. Keep going. You're making it available to me. And it just required a paragraph. And all of a sudden, it produced a book, and I would, a speaking tour, and all the, and it was just like, I'm telling, the world knows about Kailen's story, and they know more about Jesus simply because I made that pain available to Him. And the credit is His, period. It was 0% me, 100% Him, and that's always the case. But He won't waste it, and that is an abiding hope, is that your agony is not for nothing. Like it's never for nothing. And you can take solace in that and in the Lord. And the last thing, which we touched on a little bit, is the Lazarus Within. The whole point of that book was to talk about the resurrecting power of hope, and which is, as we said before, is a choice. We have hope purely because of what Jesus did. His resurrection is proof that we too will have new life. New bodies. And so the way we choose to carry the load is ultimately what will define our life after loss. We're all going to have losses, like you said. Pain and grief are universal experiences. But it's not fatal. The soil of life after loss can be very fertile if you allow the Lord to cultivate it. You know, and it's there again, choosing hope, making it available to Him. Life after loss can be just as hope-filled and vibrant as it was before, and often for many people, for many believers, it is. And so I'm grateful to God and grateful to the Lord every day, every moment of every day, for the fact that He never left me.
Yeah.
And if I choose Him, if I choose hope, He continues to revitalize my life beyond this devastating loss.
Yeah. Buddy, what a heck of a podcast, man. Thanks so much for coming on. It's neat to watch God show up in people's lives in ways that you would never anticipate, and to see how He heals and is healing, and how He provides and how He restores. I mean, just to think about your wife now and your kids and all of that, to be a widower at 26 and to have walked through all this stuff in the last 10 years is unbelievable. So I appreciate your courage for jumping on, man, and even just making yourself available for people. I'm going to say that here in a second, but dude, thanks for coming on and sharing your story, buddy.
It's a privilege, Scott. Thank you for having me, brother.
Yeah, dude, it's awesome. Our Georgetown campus is full of just some great families, and I'm so glad that God connected you with some great ones, and you guys are doing some great work there and pouring into people and marriages and all that. But Bryan didn't ask me to do this, but in the show notes, you'll find both of his books, even if you don't, A Love Story and then The Lazarus Within, are just great resources from somebody inside of our church of what God has done. And so if you're interested in doing more of a deep dive about grief, or know someone that's been through something hard, I'd love for you to pick up those books. Another resource I want to make you aware of is C.S. Lewis' book, A Grief Observed. It's different than his other writings. It's a reflection about his loss of his wife in a very tragic way, and it's very honest reflections about life and death and faith in the midst of loss. So I think it's helpful for us just as we develop our own theology of what it looks like to be in the kingdom, but also to be in this world, but waiting for another world, waiting for Jesus to come back, or for our bodies to give out, and eventually for us to go from faith to sight. And so that's a great resource. I'll also remind you of two additional podcasts. We just did this one with Gary. It's called Navigating Grief, Breaking Chains. It's February 28, 2025. And then there's one that's really special to our podcast as well. It's one that James Rutledge, JR, is on. He's one of our staff members. Scott had him on the podcast. JR is a big part of our production team. He's almost always in here, and he's not here today, but he's almost always in here sitting just right outside of the shot. And they talk about his story. JR and his wife Lauren, they got married, they went on their honeymoon, and everything changed in a blink of an eye. Very similar to what Bryan walked through, but theirs was 19 days after they were married. JR lost Lauren. And I listened to it again as I was writing this one, getting ready for it, just thinking about that. And just really tough, but also really, really helpful and insightful. So if you haven't heard it, man, you should check out that, and I'll put it in the show notes. One last thing, if you have someone in your life that is going through a hard time, or they need to navigate grief or loss, we have something called Grief Share here. And Grief Share is a national thing. It's a Christian resource that's been put together, and lots of churches use it. It's a 13-week group experience with other people that are navigating the loss and pain of grief, and also with leaders who have walked through that and are willing to get beside people to help them walk through theirs as well. And so if you're interested in doing that, or need somebody that somebody that needs to check it out, go to southland.church/groups and look for the next Grief Share and figure out when you can jump into the next one. So again, Bryan, thanks for jumping on, buddy. Appreciate you.
Thank you, brother.
If this podcast has encouraged you, share it. I'd share it with me. Let me know if you're interested in what it means to follow Jesus, get baptized. If you're interested in talking to Bryan or even Aaron about some of this stuff, you can send me an email at lockerroom@southland.church. I'd be happy to connect you with the right resources with them. And as always, if this podcast has encouraged you, share it with a friend. You never know how an episode like this is going to help somebody that's walked through a really hard season. Again, thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time on Locker Room.